Alex, you were the driving force behind the South Australian Liberal Party's recent decision to abandon net zero by 2050, and you called on the federal Libs to also walk away from net zero. But just hours later, the South Australian Liberal leader poured cold water on the move, telling reporters that none of these policy discussions bind any of the parliamentary wings of the party. Tell my audience what's going on. Are the South Australian Libs walking away from net zero, or are you sort of still half pregnant?
Well, look, Rita, what we're talking about actually was a motion that went through our state council of the Liberal Party. It meets quarterly and for pre-selections, but this was just a routine meeting. There were a number of party members and others who were involved in putting forward a policy discussion about whether or not the federal parliamentary party should be continuing to press on with net zero, supporting net zero. And the overwhelming response was no, it shouldn't be, which was very, very encouraging. And that motion was passed. And so the parliamentary party, I guess, have received that message from the South Australian division that the members here don't want that support to continue, and they don't want it for good reason. I mean, for a whole range of reasons, but for all the reasons we've been talking about for a very long period of time, net zero in itself is really nothing more than a catch cry from a time gone by. Really, I've been saying it's a sort of a catch cry from globalist bureaucrats who are really doing nothing more than making China rich at our expense. And so I think it's a very good position. I hope it's adopted by the federal party. The state party, of course, weren't actually mentioned in the motion. They have their own position, and that's fair enough too. But ultimately, this comes back to listening to our members, which is what we are here to do, and we should continue to do so.
Well, so far we haven't had really any clarity from the new Liberal leader, Susan Lee, on net zero. It's under review with a bunch of other policies. But how much longer is that going to take, Alex? Surely the party knows where it stands on this crucial issue. You've backed net zero and lost 2 elections badly. I don't understand what the confusion is here. Surely, if you want to provide the Australian public with a clear choice on this crucial policy area, you have to back away.
Well, let me start off by telling you what my own view on the issue of the so-called climate wars is, and that is that we should be providing the cheapest possible power we can possibly provide, which, of course, comes back to coal and gas, and we should be doing that. And Senator Matt Canavan and I were, I think, some of the only, if not the only, members of the coalition who opposed the flip to net zero during the Morrison era in 2022 or 21, whenever it was at the end of that term. And actually, if you look back on the history of it, we went to the 2019 election with the very strong message that we're going to save the weekend and with no net zero policy, and had, of course, for a range of reasons, but that being one of them, a very, very strong return from the electorate compared to the following 2 elections, which have been no good, the last one being the worst when we've adopted net zero. Now, obviously, there are a multitude of factors here, but putting Australia first has got to mean dumping net zero, and I hope we do come to that position, and I hope we come to it quickly as a party.
Absolutely. 2019, you won the unwinnable election and energy policy. Remember, they called it a referendum on climate change policies, and the coalition won. Now, the UK government has announced overnight that they're going to be overhauling their defence budget. They'll be increasing the budget to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. The US is pushing Australia to lift our defence spending, but the Prime Minister is so far refusing. Apparently, the UK is a very different place to Australia.
The UK is in a different place from Australia. We determine our defence policy here. We're a sovereign nation that need to have pride in our sovereignty and in our capacity to make decisions in our national interest.
Alex, the PM is talking tough there. He wasn't so tough when Chinese warships were doing live fire exercises and were detected just 150 nautical miles from Sydney, but so far he is refusing to entertain increased spending on defence.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one for the Prime Minister. I mean, this is the Prime Minister, of course, who suggested that the President of the United States scared the excrement out of him a while back. So Maybe that's part to do with it. I don't know. But I would have thought that protecting Australia's borders was the #1 priority of a Prime Minister and a government, and defence spending would be one of them. And this is very consistent with what the Trump administration's been doing all over the world. It's no surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to this government. They've seen the pitch for higher spending throughout Europe for a long time. In fact, going back to the first Trump administration. And why should Australia be any different? I mean, this government can find money for all sorts of things, including hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for the voice referendum, to build larger bureaucracies to brick in their mates in Canberra, and for a whole range of, so-called intermittent power. They don't call them that. We're going to call them that. Intermittent power, not renewable power subsidies all over the country, but they can't find money to defend our borders. I mean, where are the priorities of this government? We need a government that's Australia first, and spending on defence is high on the priority list, I would have thought.
Now, the Prime Minister has left proposed superannuation tax hikes open to negotiation in an effort to possibly sideline the Greens in the Senate and strike a deal with the coalition instead. But Alex, surely any coalition backing of this tax hike has to exclude the plan to tax unrealised capital gains. That has to go.
Well, look, Rita, I mean, at the end of the day, it's very simple. We are the party of low taxes and of small government, and we need to be very resolute on that. I mean, it is true to say that this Senate in particular is going to provide an interesting series of decisions for our leadership team. I mean, there are now, I think they need the coalition or the Greens to pass laws. On one side of the fence, you'd have an argument that allowing the Greens to be negotiated with over the top of us will mean that we get worse law turned into even worse law. But my position on this, for what it's worth, my personal position is that the Liberal Party should always be true to its core beliefs, the We Believe statement, and we should always stand for lower taxes. And that doesn't always mean doing a deal, even if it means a worse result in some instances. I think in some cases we need to just simply allow Labor and the Greens to show what they're made of here, and we need to be resolute and sell that message to the Australian people that will always be lower taxed under a Liberal coalition government.
Now, a lot has been said about the Liberal Party and young voters, so let's just hear now from some young Liberals.
There's people on the Conservative side of politics that say the coalition needs to go further to the right. That's why they're losing the election. If the coalition needed to go further to the right, One Nation would be in government, but they're not.
What we had on election day was a message from the Australian people. And it's up to us now to listen and to learn, and I'm confident that the party will do that.
I think there is a little bit of a misconception that sort of Liberals are these big bad guys, or that they have some kind of very extreme view of the world. I think that's inherently incorrect. I think the more important thing to do is to sort of go, okay, what does it mean to be a Conservative in 2025? What does it mean to be sort of socially progressive but economically a bit more liberal? How does that frame now?
Now, Alex, I don't want to be unkind, but if that's the future of the Liberals, maybe you should just wind up the party now and find some new projects.
Well, look, I mean, I think, Rita, I mean, actually, I know all three in some degree, and they're all very good young people, I have to say, but we are dealing with the ABC, and the ABC does find a way to prosecute its own view of the world in many instances in a way that which you would expect they would. And I think in many instances, we could have found probably, if the ABC had contacted me and given me a heads up, I could have probably found 70 young people that might have taken a different view. But that's the way it is. It is, as they say, a broad church. And look, we're not always going to agree. What I would say, though, is that this narrative that somehow the Liberal Party, particularly here in South Australia, has gone hard right or far right or what, I mean, that only applies if you're coming from the hard left, as far as I always say. I always say I'm only far right to the far left. And what we're talking about is getting the party back to a position where it's talking about the issues that are important to Middle Australia. And I challenge anyone to tell us anything about the sort of policies that I would, push that are in that category. I think they're all very sensible, and I think a lot of mainstream Australians would agree. So I think this says more about the ABC than it does any of our young Liberals, frankly.
Absolutely. Now, before you go, earlier today, the latest GDP figures were released, and it's not great for the economy. Australia's GDP increased by just 0.2% in the March quarter. That's lower than the 0.6% we saw in December and lower than the expectations that economists had. Alex, the key figure here is the per capita figure. GDP per capita has gone back 0.4%, and that's really what impacts people.
Yeah, and of course we've seen similar stats over the last quarter or so about the decline in disposable income. We're now, I think, leading the Western world. Leading, I use that term very loosely. I think 8% we've gone backwards over the last term. And I mean, look, this is just unfortunately where we're up to. I mean, we are, as we have said many times, under this government and under this ethos, a nation in decline, sadly. And look, our job is to provide a strong alternative, both economically and I would say culturally. You know, unfortunately, it's going to be a rough ride the next 3 years for Australians. So we just have to do everything we can to push back on that.
Well, this is what's so remarkable. Yes, it was a very lacklustre election campaign from the Libs, but Australia has just seen the biggest drop in living standards in the developed world, and the party that oversaw that has been returned in a landslide. What does that say about the election campaign that the Libs ran?
Well, look, I mean, there's been a lot said about it. I've said a lot about it as well. I think it needs to be properly reviewed, of course, but I would say from the outset that we need to be very clear about what we stand for. And I don't think that the campaign did that and did it on a range of reasons. Look, this is what we're talking about when we're saying getting the party back to what Middle Australia is talking about. We can't be frightened of issues which the left push, which are otherwise seen as being radioactive. Most mainstream Australians are talking about them, be they economic, be they cultural, and we have to be out and loud and proud about it. And it's as simple as that. And that's my hope for the next election cycle, is that we start putting some clear alternatives and non-Labor light alternatives.
Yes, non-Labor light being the key words there. Senator Alex Antic, thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks, Rita.